The rise and fall of the American Mafia. In this video, we'll take a look at the rise and fall of the American Mafia and how the FBI and the US government finally caught up with the notorious criminal organization. To some, the mob represents an appealing way of life full of glamour, guns, and girls. There is also a dark side to this organization that thrives on fear and is more likely to resolve conflicts with violence than peaceful dialogue. Despite this, the mob has undoubtedly played a significant role in shaping our culture, and many people have a favorite mob movie or iconic quote they can recite on command. The roots of the American Mafia can be traced back to the five families who controlled New York City for decades. They made their fortunes through both legitimate businesses and illegal activities, such as gambling, protection rackets, and contract murder. These families established a blueprint for organized crime that would spread across America and may have even played a role in the death of a president. The origins of the Mafia can be traced back to the 18th century on the Italian island of Sicily. Over time, private armies formed, which evolved into families with their own codes and ways of dispensing rough justice. In the late 19th and early 20th century, many Italians emigrated to the United States, including a significant number from Sicily who settled in Little Italy on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Criminals from the old country quickly exploited this immigrant population, and the notorious Five Points Gang terrorized New York for 30 years. In 1920, Prohibition hit America, and the government's attempt to ban alcohol led to a boom in bootlegging and the rise of organized crime. The American Mafia grew in size and strength throughout the 1920s, thanks in part to the influx of new recruits from Italy who were fleeing Mussolini's crackdown on the Mafia. Joe the Boss Masseria was running the show in New York at the time, but a powerful Sicilian don, Salvatore Marenzano, wanted to take over. A bloody war ensued, and Marenzano emerged victorious, reorganizing the Mafia gangs of New York into the five families. To consolidate his newfound power, Marenzano declared himself Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. However, the other heads of the five families disliked Marenzano and saw him as greedy, arrogant, and old-fashioned. Lucky Luciano, who had switched sides during the war and helped Marenzano win, set up the hit that killed Marenzano and established the Commission, a group of 7 mafia leaders responsible for overseeing the activities of the mob and mediating disputes between rival gangs. With a solid structure in place, the five families began to diversify their business interests and infiltrate labor unions to establish themselves in industries such as construction, trucking, and waste management. While they continued to engage in traditional criminal activities such as robbery, extortion, loan sharking, and money laundering, they also looked for new avenues to make money. The 1940s saw the rise of Las Vegas, which provided yet another opportunity for the families to expand their operations. The rise of the greatest center of vice on God's green earth, despite being on the opposite coast to the five families' traditional stomping grounds, was too tempting to resist. They funded several casinos in Sin City, skimming money from the huge sums of cash taken on the floors every night. This scam netted them hundreds of millions of dollars for decades. It seemed as though the Mafia was untouchable, with their code of silence known as Omerta, which forbade members from cooperating with the police under fear of death. Infiltrating the families was practically impossible because allegiances often went back generations to the same small towns in Italy. The US government was slow to respond, and the mob continued to grow in power and numbers. However, law enforcement slowly started to fight back. In 1950, a special committee was set up to investigate organized crime, holding hearings in 14 cities across the country with testimony from over 600 witnesses. The hearings were televised at a time when TV was just starting to take off, and it was the first time most Americans had even heard about this shadowy organization, which seemed to exert influence over huge swaths of their country. All of this attention was bad news for the mob. The Mafia's bad luck continued in 1957 when a meeting was arranged in the small town of Appalachian in upstate New York. More than 100 important crime bosses and assorted henchmen attended to discuss all kinds of nefarious activities. The problem was that Halichin was little more than a hamlet, and when numerous flashy cars arrived and deposited large numbers of extremely well-dressed, severe-looking gentlemen in the middle of town, the local police force couldn't help but wonder just what the hell was going on. They raided the property, causing the highly unusual and not a little humiliating scene of dozens of gangsters running away to hide in the nearby woods. Amazingly, this shrub-based counterintelligence tactic didn't work, and 60 of them were arrested. In 1959, mobster Joe Vellecci was convicted of drug trafficking and sentenced to 15 years in prison. While inside, he murdered a fellow inmate, a move that saw his sentence extended to life behind bars with no chance of parole. Clearly, the prospect of eating slop from a tray and trying really bloody hard not to drop his soap in the shower didn't thrill Vellecci, because in 1963, he agreed to testify about his time in the mob. This was the first time a made man had ever taken the stand and publicly admitted the mafia existed, let alone got into details about its structure and activities. Vellecci even went as far as to name many current and former gangsters, including bosses of the major families. Vellecci's hearing was part of a crusade by Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who'd made it his personal mission to target organized crime. He did a brilliant job of it too, with mobster convictions rising 800% during his time in office. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in November 1963 was a seismic event, but it couldn't stop the events that Vellecci's confession had set in motion. Several laws were subsequently passed by Congress to give the FBI greater power to tackle the mafia head-on, the most groundbreaking being the so-called RICO Act of 1970. The act essentially made it illegal to be part of an ongoing criminal enterprise, regardless of whether or not you were actually caught committing any crimes. That made it significantly easier to convict known mobsters. But more importantly, it suddenly made it possible to go after mob bosses who were unlikely to ever get directly involved in the dirty work their organizations were built on.